Great, I think we're ready to start. So hi everyone, just briefly, again, I'm Stephanie Hood. I'm based in the Institute's communications team, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to the 7th and final event of our Institute's Colloquium series, Trusting Science. Just our usual admin, at the Q&A at the end, please raise your hand, or if needed, you can add a question in the chat function. We will be recording the talk for publishing online, but we won't record the Q&A. So if you ask any questions at the end, you won't be recorded. Please just check that you're muted if you're not speaking. And I'd like to thank, as always, those involved in organising this series. So our research group members, the administration, our library, and the rest of the communications team, and of course the speakers and the audience. And before I introduce Lara Keuck, today's colloquium organizer, I'm really happy to welcome our director and director of Department 3, Dagmar Schäfer, who will present briefly on occasion of this being the final event in this year's series. So Dagmar.
Thank you very, Steph. And I would like to start by echoing the note of gratitude and expanding it to the organizers of the series, who have offered us an exciting year of events, of thinking about the trusting aspects of sciences. And I will keep my remarks very brief, but I want to say some things about the rather presentist notion that this Institute's colloquium has taken with this topic. It originated not only, certainly, as we all know, in the COVID crisis, but also in some substantial questions about the role that the history of science and the sociology of science has to take herein in contemporary as much as in historical debates. I think that the series of events made me at least thoroughly rethink how to approach this topic of trust that is so central in the history of science and has been over the last decades. How sciences are trustworthy because they seem to offer objective information beyond political agendas and ideologies, and how this discourse has changed to be about the sciences and returned to the history of sciences as a political category and also as a political force to be reckoned. I think what I would like to stress with all the different and very great kaleidoscope of insights that we could gain over the year is what excited me a lot was this return to the idea of evidence, especially as we heard it twice in evidence-based medicine. I'm pretty sure you can recall these events as much as the discussion we had about sciences as a quasi-universally internationally expansive, relevant category, how its narratives have become a part of political debates, and how the history of science and the genealogies that it's actually using need to be expanded. The question that stands very much in the room of the history of science as a political category is how it offers, or how it offers itself to the communities that are interested in it and to the communities that think about the sciences. I may briefly remind you about the very interesting session we had about free access to data, free access to information, and free access to knowledge itself and the sciences itself. The more information is out there, as we have learned through this series, but also through experiences by ourselves, like in ourselves here in the epidemic, the more trustworthy we once thought would be science. But what we really see is that the more information is out there, the more difficult it becomes to generate trust in the sciences. I think that the series in this regard was a huge success. I would like to thank you all for allowing us to think seriously about these questions, about trusting sciences and the trust in the sciences. I will not try to provide any conclusion on the series itself. I will leave that to Lara, who will now also say some words about today's content. I would, however, encourage you to further not drop the topic with this Institute's colloquium, but maybe think about it further, in particular as the history of science is regionally expanding and also should probably also be temporarily being expanded again to earlier periods. Thank you very much for being with us in this series.
Thank you so much, Dagmar, for these very, very kind and yeah, also encouraging words, I would say. And I also cannot give a conclusion at all, because I think I very much agree that this can only be a beginning and not an ending of thinking about trust in science. And what we try to do is maybe throughout this series, just like showing different ways in which we can approach this question and think about trust in the system of science, the system of medicine, challenges to that, different like local ways of doing it, differentiated ways in which assessments are made, connected problems, public trust and internal trust within sciences. And with this last Institute's colloquium, we want to kind of like really come to this last issue, but also look at the interconnectedness to all of these other issues. So we will look at the history of the reproducibility crisis. And that's a crisis, as our speakers will tell us, that have been very influential in the past 2 or 3 decades in psychology and in biomedicine. But there are also several other disciplines that have kind of like discussed problems under this header. And I'm extremely glad to present to you today our 2 speakers. So Nicole Nelson will give us a presentation on historicizing the reproducibility crisis. And I'll just open here the slide. Hope it works. I'm sorry. Maybe Steph, you have to open the slide. Nicole is an associate professor of science and technology studies in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin, Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. And her first book, Model Behavior, published in 2018, is an ethnographic study of how animal behavior geneticists conceptualize and enact complexity in research with mouse models. And actually, thanks to our great library team, you can also have a look at the virtual bookshelf and see her books and articles there. And what's also very interesting for us as a scientific community is that Nicole is an incoming editor-in-chief at the journal Social Studies of Science. She's the founding director of the Health and the Humanities program at Madison and a former scholar in residence at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University. Her current research focuses on the reproducibility crisis in biomedicine and its relationship to histories of biomedical and open science research reform. And Nicole's talk will be followed by a comment by someone with whom she actually has collaborated also for some time, and that is Lisa Malich. And we are very happy also to have her here. Lisa Malich is a professor for the history of knowledge of psychology and psychotherapy at the University of Lübeck. She studies psychology with a focus on the history of psychology and gender at the Freie Universität Berlin and at the Indiana University in Bloomington. She has a doctoral degree in history from HU Berlin and had a DFG fellowship at the research training group Gender as a Category of Knowledge at the HU. Between 2012 and 2015, Lisa worked as a research assistant at the Institute for the History of Medicine at the Charité, and she has undertaken research on the history of emotions in pregnancy, on the history of trauma, and the replication crisis in psychology. So we are very, very happy to have both of you here. And now I would just give the floor to Nicole.
All right. Good morning / good afternoon, depending on where on the globe you are. And thank you for having me. All right, there we go. How are the slides looking? Good? Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about distrust of academic science and how it is that the reproducibility crisis narrative has given rise to this conversation about whether academic science is as rigorous as it is, as some believed that it was prior to this conversation about 15 or so years ago. But in order to get us there, I'm actually going to start by talking about distrust in industry science, taking us to the first decade of the 21st century to talk about scandals that happened within pharmaceutical knowledge production. I've given you a little selection here on the slide of a bunch of books and headlines from events that made news in the US at least, all of which were talking about pharmaceutical knowledge production and whether or not the kind of knowledge that was coming specifically out of clinical trials was trustworthy. If we could believe that that knowledge was, produced according to standards that were rigorous and gave us fair information about the efficacy of certain drug treatments. So just as a couple of examples of the types of things that were, that were part of that conversation in the early 2000s, one large sort of study here that I've got for you in the bottom of the screen, published in the New England Journal of Medicine on antidepressant efficacy, found that there were a number of studies which showed risks of suicidal ideation in people who took SSRIs that had been suppressed by pharmaceutical companies through selective publication. So essentially clinical trials in which somebody had committed suicide as a result of taking an antidepressant, those pharmaceutical or industry-sponsored trials, the pharmaceutical companies involved opted not to publish them. And so the effect of doing so was that the literature gave a greater sense of safety and efficacy of these SSRIs than the full picture of data showed. And some of the research in this area was attempting to show that if you took these other clinical trials into account, the efficacy was lower and the risks were higher. So we were getting a kind of incomplete picture that was affecting clinical practice. Another event that made headlines in the mid-2000s was an incident involving Pfizer and a clinical trial that they had run in Nigeria, which was part of a trend happening at this point in history towards the global offshoring of clinical trials. And this is where American pharmaceutical companies were increasingly looking towards elsewhere in the world to be able to run their clinical trials in order to be able to do them faster, cheaper, and with a less medicated population than the American population. So in this particular case, Pfizer had been running a clinical trial with children with a drug that turned out to be harmful. And in addition to the harm caused by the novel agent that they were testing, the disease that they were testing against, meningitis, had a standard of care of antibiotics. But Pfizer, in the design of this clinical trial, had decided to give a lower dose than would be given as standard of care in America to these children enrolled in the clinical trial, on the sort of assumption that standard of care in Nigeria was basically nothing. And so in order to be able to show that their novel agent was more efficacious, they wanted to compare it to a lower dose of antibiotics so that it would look a lot better than it actually was. So it's sort of sneaky knowledge production moves like this that prompted Marcia Angel, who's the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, a major American medical journal, to write this book in the mid-2000s, 2004, called The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It, that talked about these and other practices like selective publication, changing comparator doses, adjusting endpoints in order to make drugs look better than they actually are. So this was the situation that we found ourselves in, 15, 20 years ago. And I want to fast forward up to the present day to provide you a point of comparison, which is where I want to get to by the end of the talk. This is a conference that I was at the National Institutes of Health in the United States just here about 3 weeks ago, sponsored by the NINDS, which is the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. And it was on research rigor in academic science. The premise of this conference was that academic science is presently not rigorous enough. And what we need to do to rectify this state of affairs is find rigor champions who are willing to, within their own institutional locales, advocate for better practices within the sciences. And questions of trust were very much at the forefront here. The director of the NINDS, in his opening speech in the conference, actually defined rigor as science we can trust. That was his literal definition. He said, I want to be able to say when I go to Congress and I talk about how it is that we're spending the appropriation for our budget, I want to be able to say that we're giving them good knowledge that they can trust, that you can trust, the American people can trust. So trust was at the forefront here, but what was up for question was not trust in pharmaceutical knowledge, it was trust in academic knowledge production practices. And in fact, here, pharmaceutical knowledge production practices were to some extent valorized. One of the speakers at the conference actually pointed to some of the few members of the audience who were pharmaceutical industry scientists and asked the audience, or asked those members of the audience, for some input on how it is that we could borrow the rigorous practices from pharmaceutical knowledge production and import them into academia. He asked them directly, quote, how is it that pharma is able to motivate people to work very hard and very rapidly and very rigorously to solve problems like producing vaccines? So implicit in this quote is the sense that pharmaceutical knowledge production practices are actually better than academic knowledge production practices, and that we can learn from and borrow from the kinds of knowledge production practices that are taking place in industry. So, oops, there we go. The question for today's talk is, how did pharma go from bad actor to epistemic role model over the last 15 years? Or conversely, how is it that academic science went from being a place of trustworthy knowledge production to a place where its trustworthiness was in question? And that's what I hope to be able to unfurl for you in the next 25 or so minutes. So in order to answer this question, I'm going to back up just a little bit, not too far, to look at the narrative that was underpinning some of those pharmaceutical PR crises that took place in the mid-2000s. And what was motivating the bad behavior of these actors was broadly agreed upon in this era to be what came to be known as the pipeline problem. The pipeline problem, as it was framed, was the following. There were increasing amounts of dollars being pumped into biomedical research spending. I'm just going to get my little pointer out here. So in this graph here, what you see is starting in 1993, you see an increasing curve here in both pharmaceutical R&D spending as well as spending from the US National Institutes of Health. So what you're supposed to take away from this graph is that more money is being pumped into the system, but what's coming out is staying stable or even declining. So in this companion graph here on the other side, giving you the same time period, what you can see is the total number of new drug applications, that's what NDA stands for, received by the FDA. And you can see that it's relatively stable, even maybe taking a dip here in the year 2001. And on the bottom here is what's called original biological agents. That means genuinely new drugs, as opposed to a different dose of an already known drug or something like this that could be included in this category. So if you take a look at the category here of original biological agents, what you can see here is that 1993 represents quite the high watermark, and then there's a sort of slow downward trend continuing into the 2000s. This is from an FDA report examining the pipeline problem that was published in 2004. And the argument that they were putting forward was that there was some sort of blockage in the system that meant that the money that was being pumped into biomedical research wasn't actually translating into novel drugs. And therefore, something needed to be done in the system in order to unblock it so that we could reap the rewards of this money that was being pumped into biomedical research. Now, what exactly did they think was the problem? The dominant narrative here within this FDA report and others was what they called the Valley of Death. And this is an image that comes from a little bit later, 2008. And it's a kind of metaphor that exists from the early days of discussions of the pipeline problem. And this was an image that became kind of like a scientific meme later on. When I was doing fieldwork in cancer conferences around 2011 to 2014, this was an absolutely ubiquitous image that showed up in lots of people's talk slides because many people gravitated towards this metaphor as an explanation for what was going on in oncology drug development. So in this metaphor, the source of the problem, of the pipeline problem, is basically that there's very little interaction between the bench scientists over here and the clinical scientists over here, represented by the wet lab tools and the patient respectively. And this rickety bridge in between them is meant to emphasize the lack of infrastructure that was connecting those two ends, so that bench scientists were doing their thing, receiving money from federal institutions, producing presumably good knowledge, but there was no infrastructure to carry over that knowledge to those clinical actors who would then be able to make use of it. And so that knowledge was essentially dying a death down here in this valley, represented by our little skeleton creature in the bottom, because there was no infrastructure to be able to carry it over. So this was a very influential framing for the pipeline problem, that led to a number of major policy initiatives in the 2000s. When NIH Director Elias Zerhouni came into office in 2003, one of his major initiatives was what was called the NIH Roadmap for Medical Research. And that was introducing the idea that what we needed was more so-called translational research. And translational research was both the infrastructure as well as the human actors who were going to be able to bridge those basic science practices with clinical medicine practices to carry across the knowledge that needed to be carried from bench to bedside. So this was a major platform point for him, as well as the FDA. The FDA released this report called the Critical Path Initiative in 2004, that those graphs that I showed you before came from, and it proposed to reform the drug approval process alongside the translational research infrastructure process so that it would be easier and faster to try and approve new drugs. So in both cases, what we have is two major federal agencies in the United States adopting this idea that there was a problem with pharmaceutical drug or with drug development, that the problem lay in this movement of knowledge from one place to the other, and that what needed to be done was various kinds of changes in order to speed up that movement. One of the major outputs of the NIH roadmap was the introduction of a new center to the NIH's suites of centers and institutes. And this was introduced in 2011, and the center's name was NCATS, or the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. This was going to be the new place that housed all of these initiatives, like training physician scientists or encouraging basic researchers to get more involved with clinical practice, that were supposed to be the infrastructure that bridged bench and bedside. So that was introduced just slightly after actually Zerhouni left, but note the date here, 2011. So this is the year in which this center was launched, and they're giving it big press to try and advertise the fact that the NIH has done something about this pipeline problem and done something to support translational science. 2011 happens to be the year that also we see a publication from a pharmaceutical company that ends up being one of the flashpoints for what will become called the reproducibility crisis. It's a paper published by a group of scientists from Bayer Pharmaceuticals in Germany, and it's published in Nature Reviews Drug Discoveries. And what they do is they look back over their own institutional history of trying to replicate results from the scientific literature in their in-house laboratories. At Bayer Pharmaceuticals and others, it's standard practice to, rather than just taking something as granted from the academic literature, to take it and see if you can make it work in your own hands by giving the method section to in-house scientists and seeing if they're able to actually just at first glance, reproduce the results that exist in the paper. So before you spend, say, $500,000 to $1 million looking at a particular drug target to see if it's interesting, you first want to see, does this particular result that indicates that the drug target is interesting, does it actually work? So in this Prinz et al. Paper, they published their account of trying to do these in-house replication studies. And what you can see from this graph here is that the largest category, this sort of weird purple here, inconsistencies, 65%. Inconsistencies is basically their nice way of saying they were unable to replicate the results from the literature. There are a couple other categories here, like some results are reproducible, but this lavender category here, literature in line with the in-house data, becomes the figure, the number that gets taken up in a lot of subsequent discussions in the popular press and elsewhere about how replicable the biomedical research literature is. And the figure that gets passed around is 21%. So in 21% of cases, scientists at biopharmaceuticals were able to actually fully replicate the results in the literature. And in all other cases, there were either inconsistencies or only some of the results actually replicated. So what this report did is it sort of bought into the pipeline problem framing, but it slightly reframed that narrative, arguing that the problem wasn't movement, it was quality. In this little excerpt here that I have taken from this original Prinz et al. Report, you can see that they start off here with a narrative about the declining rates of success in drug trials, where they're quoting a recent report here showing that phase 2 trials in this case have fallen from a 28% success rate to an 18% success rate. So this is referencing this issue here about the number of agents being pumped into the system compared to the number of things that are coming out. And what they argue, though, is rather than pointing to slowdowns in FDA process or the lack of translational research infrastructure, they say this indicates here that the validity of the targets being investigated is frequently questionable. So what they're saying here is that it's not that we have great science being done at the bench and we just need to get it into the hands of pharmaceutical companies. They're saying we have it, it's not great. That was a different message. Now, it's a message that in the end proved quite difficult for academic scientists to disagree with because of a growing amount of evidence coming out of the evidence-based medicine movement that provided support for the idea that by some measures of rigor, academic science wasn't living up to the standards of rigorous knowledge production. Now, I don't have time to give you the sort of like brief overview of the history of evidence-based medicine, but it's really kind of an analogous movement in some ways because it was questioning academic medicine and the decisions that clinicians made, which were up until this point assumed to be largely trustworthy. And evidence-based medicine was trying to give a sort of data-driven analysis of whether those decisions taking place within clinical medicine were really sound. One of the techniques that EBM practitioners used in order to be able to make their arguments for change in clinical practice was a number of techniques that fall into the category of evidence synthesis. And on this side of the left side of the slide here, I've got kind of a toy example of what one of these techniques looked like. This is a forest plot that would be frequently included in a meta-analysis, which is a gathering up of several studies to see if the overall weight of the evidence suggests that we should use a particular treatment or not use a particular treatment. The idea coming out of evidence-based medicine is that each individual study here may have a certain amount of error in it, but if we add up all of these studies, we should get a much better clinical picture of whether or not the total weight of the evidence says, yes, do something, or no, don't do something. So in this forest plot, what you see is a square that represents the number of people in this study, an error bar here that represents how much error there is in the study and the estimate, and then a line here that represents the decision point between favoring the control, be that the existing drug or doing nothing, versus favoring the intervention, meaning favoring the new drug, saying, yes, this is something you should do. And the overall estimate here is summarized by this little triangle, diamond shape. It's not a triangle, it's a diamond shape. And the width of the diamond gives you the error of the overall studies, and its position relative to this line tells you whether or not the cumulative evidence favors treatment or favors control. So in this case, you can see from the toy example that if you add up all of the studies, you get something that actually looks much more clearly like it favors the intervention than if you look at some of these individual studies that have a lot more error in them. Now, this was a technique that became broadly used in clinical medicine in the 90s and early 2000s, and eventually it began to sort of leak over into preclinical research or more basic science as a way of evaluating the evidence. So here's one of the first examples I can find from a paper in 2002 of a number of researchers who were trying to evaluate animal studies to see if the animal studies provided evidence that they should take a particular new treatment forward into human studies. This was actually a retrospective study that they had done in the wake of a failure of a clinical trial. What had happened is a number of researchers had looked at the animal evidence, thought that it seemed promising enough that they should move forward with this treatment into humans. The human clinical trial had failed, and in the postmortem of trying to figure out this clinical trial, researchers decided that what they should do is go back and retrospectively examine the evidence that they based their decision on to see if that evidence was sound. And what you can see here from this forest plot is that the diamond here is pretty much right close at the 0 line, and the error bars are still rather big, indicating that this treatment that they were trying to test, LLLT versus standard of care, the evidence was not strong for it at all. In fact, if you compile all the existing evidence, it very slightly favored standard of care, although it's kind of right around the 0 line. So particular studies that seemed to show an effect here had kind of an outside influence on people's willingness to go forward into human clinical trials. So the point of this little excursus here into evidence-based medicine and its techniques is to say that these techniques for trying to evaluate the rigor of clinical medicine had, by the mid-2000s, been imported over into some areas of preclinical research. And so when pharmaceutical companies started making the argument to say, academic preclinical research, not so good in quality, we shouldn't be focused on moving it, we should be focused on improving it, they could point to some of these studies showing that error was large, the studies themselves weren't that robust, and point to papers saying, by the standards of evidence-based medicine, we would say that this evidence isn't actually that good. So it's not just us and our experience that tells us that this evidence is bad, we actually have literature to show us that this evidence is not strong. So in this original Bayer paper published in 2011, one of the things that they call for is reform within academic science to increase its rigor, increase its robustness. It's a sort of call to action that says, okay, time for academia to clean up its act. One of their concluding paragraphs says, the lack of rigor that exists around generation and analysis of preclinical data is reminiscent of the situation in clinical research about 50 years ago. So they're basically saying, clinical medicine, we've cleaned up our act. Bench scientists, time for you to do the same thing. So this then begs the question, well, what was happening over these past 50 years that these pharmaceutical scientists were pointing to that they had in mind as what academics might need to do? So evidence-based medicine was one of these movements that was a reform movement trying to change practice based on synthesis and analysis of evidence. But based on some of the problems that I showed you right at the beginning of the talk with pharmaceutical clinical trials, there were a number of other kinds of regulatory steps taken by US federal entities to try and bring pharma into line with standards of good practice. One of those, as an example, was forcing pharmaceutical companies and others to register their trials on this website called clinicaltrials.gov. And I've got the little logo for you here on the side. That was designed to prevent problems like the problem that we saw with the SSRI data, where pharmaceutical companies could simply opt to not publish the data that didn't portray their drug in a favorable light. By registering the trial before it took place, people would know that that trial happened, and they could look for the data more easily afterwards to try and see if the entities that had sponsored the trial were simply suppressing unfavorable data. So in the mid-2000s, a number of entities, journals, funders, made it mandatory for people who are conducting clinical trials to pre-register their clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov. So when we're talking about some of the reforms that have taken place in clinical research over the last 50 years, this was one of the ones that would have been on the minds of the authors of this article, because these types of regulations had taken place really within the past decade. So the question was there going to be some entity that came down and forced academic scientists to do the same thing? One of the things that seemed to be on the mind of the director of the NIH, Francis Collins, was whether or not there would be intervention from the federal government that forced them to adopt particular practices because of the negative press arising from this Prinz et al. Article from the Bayer scientists. That article, published in 2011, ended up getting picked up by the Wall Street Journal and other major publication outlets, and through that popular press attention, got back to some of the senators who were responsible for the budget of the NIH. And about 6 months after the publication of that article, when Francis Collins, director of the NIH, is in one of those budget hearings in front of the senators who are in charge of the budget, they actually questioned him specifically about the Bayer Pharmaceuticals article and the number within it, this 21% of studies are able to replicate. Senator Shelby, who's the head of the Appropriations Committee that determines the NIH budget, asked him directly, quote, "When the NIH requests 30 billion or more in taxpayer dollars for medical research, which I think is not enough, shouldn't reproducibility, replication of these studies be part of the foundation by which the research is judged? How can the NIH address this problem? Is that a concern to you?" So he's essentially saying, I support the NIH and the money that it's getting, but this issue here of lack of reproducibility of results, these numbers are concerning and are going to cause you political problems. What are you doing about it? Francis Collins sort of heard this message loud and clear, and as I'll show you in a second, went back to the NIH and started creating new policies to try and address this. I think in large part because they were interested in trying to preempt interference or regulation through acts of self-regulation to show that they themselves were taking actions to try and make scientific research more trustworthy. As it turns out, I think this was a reasonably prescient move because the partner institution that looks at non-biomedical research in the United States, the National Science Foundation, did not take action at this moment because they saw this as really a sciences problem, even though as Lisa is going to tell us in a bit, with psychology under their umbrella, they certainly have problems to address themselves. But the NSF chose really not to do anything around reproducibility and rigor in the early years of this crisis. And what ended up happening was Congress mandated them to do something. That something became pretty toothless. It became a National Academies of Science report on reproducibility and replicability in the sciences, where they formed a committee, did some investigations, made a report. But nonetheless, it shows that Congress was willing to take up this question again and try and force academic scientists to do something if they didn't look like they would regulate themselves. NIH officials in the meantime were on it. As I said before, they were interested in trying to reform things right away to try and enhance the credibility and the reputation of the science that took place at this federal agency. So after that meeting at the Senate Appropriations Committee, which took place in mid-2012, Francis Collins at the Office of the Director goes back and starts discussing what exactly the NIH should do. And by January 2014, publishes this article in Nature on the NIH's plans to enhance reproducibility, where it lays out a number of policy points of the things that the Institute will do. And the Institute did those things. By January 2016, you see reforms across the NIH, all institutes and centers, to the granting process introduced, so that everybody who applied for an NIH grant had to address several elements, including the rigor of the research that they were basing their new studies on, as well as the rigor of their own research. So just to note here that the span here is 2 years, which for a large federal agency is massively fast. Like, it's impressively fast and shows you how interested this particular institute was in trying to conduct these reforms and sort of enhance its self-regulation of the quality of its research. All right, so to wrap up here, what I want to argue here is that the reproducibility crisis narrative that has happened over the last 10 to 15 years around preclinical research or bench science is quite similar to previous reform movements that we've seen, such as evidence-based medicine, in that what it's doing and what is shocking about it is it's calling into question the practices of academic knowledge producers who were broadly assumed to be sort of credible actors prior to these conversations. not by everyone. There are certainly places in which you can see, people questioning particular bits of methodologies. But this idea that the whole of bench science has problems that need to be reformed, the sort of scale of the conversation, is something that's rather new with the reproducibility crisis narrative. And it's similar in scale to the evidence-based medicine narrative that all of clinical medicine needs to be reformed. Now, what counts though as rigorous research in here is never very specifically defined in a lot of these articles. And so what ends up happening is that the definition of rigor that's being employed borrows from both evidence-based medicine and the techniques that they use to show rigor, as well as industry and regulatory science. Essentially, what the Bayer article and subsequent articles from pharmaceutical actors are arguing is academic science isn't rigorous if it doesn't work with our in-house procedures. It needs to better align with what we do in our labs. Otherwise, we're not going to consider it rigorous. So what happens as a result of this narrative from the reproducibility crisis is that we see something, kind of good happen for pharma's sort of PR, public relations moment, where it shifts from bad actor to role model, in the sense that pharma is able to kind of claim the moral high ground in reproducibility discussions and say, look, we had problems, but we cleaned them up. We've adopted better practices. We now pre-register trials because we were forced to, in order to make sure that publication bias isn't as much of an issue. Time for you to do the same. So really it's able to, position itself as being the credible actor that academic science should look to in order to improve the trustworthiness of its data. What happens in this move is not only that pharma is able to recuperate some of its public image, is that it stands to benefit from this better alignment between academic science and its own practices. Because the standard of rigor that's being employed here comes from clinical medicine as well as industry science, the reforms that are implemented in academic medicine are all reforms that make it look a little bit more like those clinical or like those industry practices. So it allows pharmaceutical companies to be able to draw more directly from academic science without having to do as much internal work in order to streamline their own processes so that they don't have to do as much in-house work. So that better alignment between pharmaceutical companies or industry generally speaking and academic science is another feature of the reproducibility crisis that I think is quite worth noting, because it's not just about restoring the trustworthiness of academic or of preclinical research. It's about restoring it in a way that better aligns it with these existing interests. Okay, so I will leave it there, turn you over to Lisa. And Lisa, I look forward to hearing what you got to say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. And then Lisa, I would immediately give you the floor, the virtual one.
Great, thank you very much, Nicole. I really appreciate your work so much, and I really like it. And Nicole sent me a chapter of her upcoming book, a draft of it, and I can just highly recommend the book already, because the chapter was basically your talk, but of course with much more information and really interesting arguments. So what I wanted to start, let me just start with my time, my 10 minutes, so that I don't speak too long. Okay. So what I want to do in this comment is first highlight the things that I especially liked about Nicole's argument, and then I would like to sometimes refer to the special issue I just recently edited together with Marcus Manafo, because I'm not really doing research so much on the replication crisis, but I'm kind of a very interested observer of the replication or reproducibility crisis. I always use the word replication crisis, as you can know, because I can just pronounce the other term. Yeah, and 3 years ago, we had a conference in Lübeck on the replication crisis in psychology, and Nicole was one of our speakers, and recently our special issue on the replication crisis in psychology came out. So yeah, the first part. Thank you again, Nicole. This was really inspiring, and I really, yeah, a great piece of your really important project on the replication crisis. I especially wanted to mention two things that I really enjoyed a lot. The first one is that you point so much on the public image of a pharmaceutical industry and the distrust actually not only in science, but also in pharmaceutical science and how this interacts with the distrust in science or the trust in science. I thought that was a really interesting point and an important information dimension if you discuss about distrust in science. And I think you showed really well how the PR, the bad PR about pharmaceutical industry also kind of the reframing of through the replication crisis helped to make the image of pharmaceutical research much better and actually helped to enhance the image. So I think that was a really important point. And what really convinced me as well was also the combination of your research methods that was actually more obvious in the chapter you sent me on this talk, because I think it was really helpful because you also use oral history. And I think that was a really interesting dimension. You just, yeah, the background of the two articles from 2011, that they were actually, the background was not only to get a better public image for the pharmaceutical industry, but that it was also kind of the problem of in-house scientists who wanted kind of to protect their research group. Because the pharmaceutical companies wanted to abolish these replication groups within their companies. So they published these articles to actually show that their work is really important. And I think that was a really interesting turn. And I really liked that. And I really liked that you focused so much also on infrastructure, that academic research and pharmaceutical industrial research has to fit together to make more use of it, and that the practices have to align well. I think that was also a really interesting point. Now, let me just, okay, let's, yeah. Okay, so that's, yeah, let me just go now to a comment where I want to refer to our special issues sometimes. Two additional points that came to my mind when I heard your talk and also read the really interesting chapter. The first one was, of course, working conditions and the labor of academic research, both in science and in clinical research, as a researcher who works for pharmaceutical companies. In narratives of the replication crisis today, the perverse incentive structure of academia plays an important role, and it's always discussed as one factor of the replication crisis. And I guess we all know what this is: limited short-term contracts, the pressure to publish, new metrics of publications that emphasize quantity, but also, of course, impact factors, the pressure to attract external funding, and etc. And yeah, all this suggests, of course, that for researchers in biomedicine and in other disciplines, it's much better for their own career and their labor conditions if their experiments are successful. That means that they should have outcomes that are as successful as possible, that have big effect sizes that are significant. And of course, the results of experiments should be really surprising and really clear, because that helps you to secure your job in a way. And I think that was also a narrative that was really important already in 2011, really early on, at least incentive structures. And in this special issue, that's also one of the one piece was really interesting for me that actually engaged in this. It was by Felicity Kellett, and she had her piece Replication and Reproduction, Crisis in Psychology and Academic Labor. And in this piece, Felicity argued that we should pay closer attention to labor conditions in academia, not only to research culture or epistemic culture. And I think that's a really important point, because at least in German history of science, we tend to focus on culture, and it sounds like more neutral, but actually she says, well, it's not culture, it's actually labor conditions. It's kind of an old-fashioned topic, but it's really important. And she argues that there are parallels between the replication crisis and the timing of the replication crisis, and of course the crisis of academic labor, or the crisis of social reproduction. And I found it really interesting. She said that both crises describe a failure in processes of reproducing something, and she points to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 that preceded the emergence of the replication crisis. And actually, this financial crisis exacerbated the ongoing tendency in the organization and practices of university research, particularly the use of precarious contracts and the adjunctification of research. So I think that's an important point. The other point was something I read recently on Twitter on labor conditions in academia. On Twitter, there are a lot of tweets at the moment leaving academia because of bad working conditions in academia. And most of the people I follow there come from psychology or biomedicine, and they all go to industry. And then there are a lot of tweets that say, well, work is so much better in the industry. We have 9 to 5, we have better conditions, we have long-term contracts, we earn so much more money. And actually, I really love reading these tweets, because it sounds, oh my goodness, that's so good. But actually, I think most of these people go to pharmaceutical companies. So, and I found that really interesting, because in a way, is it really leaving it academia in a way? And especially if you have this PR image of a pharmaceutical industry in mind. You talked about that it became an epistemic role model, and now I feel like in this discourse it becomes also an ethical role model for good working conditions. Which is kind of an irony, because you wrote it yourself and you referred to the book of Mark Robinson, The Market in Mind. This academic problem is also part of the pharmaceutical industry problem, which outsourced much of its preclinical research to public universities in 2000. So it's actually not leaving academia in a way. It's actually part of the problem that you go to for pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, and I found that really interesting. So that was one part, the working conditions. And of course, the second part was the role of psychology. And of course, it's kind of a little bit funny that I asked you this question now, because actually it was you and your research group who published in our special issue on the role of psychology. But nevertheless, I have to say it again. For me as a psychologist, the story of the replication crisis is kind of a completely different one. I was really an interested observer from the beginning on, and I already started to follow kind of the replication crisis in psychology also in 2011, but I would kind of speak of totally different papers and totally different cases. In psychology, it really started at the exact time, also in 2011. And there are at least 2 widely discussed papers that are often mentioned as major papers who fostered the crisis. There was an article on false positive psychology that by Simmons and colleagues that demonstrated the simplicity with which researchers could gather statistically significant evidence for a false hypothesis. And then there was actually something like a false hypothesis also published in 2011 that was discussed a lot, because actually there was an article by a really prominent researcher, by Ben, and he published an article in a peer-reviewed article in a peer-reviewed journal. And he used just widely recognized and established experimental statistical methods, and he claimed to find evidence in an experiment that humans are able to perceive the future. And somehow this hypothesis, a lot of people didn't buy it, of course, that people are able to see into the future, but he could in a way prove it with regular statistics. So that was also kind of a big starting point of a debate if the statistics you use actually in psychology are really the right statistics, if something like this could happen and could be published. So these are more like the two articles that started it. And now I'm already over my time, so I will finish really soon. Yeah, and of course, this story of psychology kind of feeds into what you called a psychology's exceptionalism in your other paper in our special issue. And in this paper, you tried to kind of argue against this narrative of psychology's exceptionalism, that it was so separate there. And you said, yeah, you wanted to rebalance this narrative by examining the emergence and evolution of replication discussions in psychology alongside their emergence and evolution in biomedicine. And there you looked only at recent discourses, at least as I remember. You used the mixed methods analysis and focused on commentaries. And you said, well, actually, there are a lot of overlaps. The effectiveness of peer review, the need for greater transparency of methods and data, and the incentive structure of academia, that these are common topics. But now I was wondering, because you went more into the history of the replication crisis, how you would situate the discipline of psychology. And within this history, is it more like on the side of evidence-based medicine, or is it more like on the side of translational science, or is it a third trajectory? So that's my last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this wonderful commentary. And I posted the link to your introduction also into the chat so that everyone can have a look. And now I would like to give Nicole the chance to briefly respond to your points and questions. And everyone else who wants to ask a question, then please follow the model of Schooley and raise your virtual hand or post your question in the chat, and you will then get the chance after Nicole's reply.
Thank you for that, Lisa. And I really appreciate too the kind of ongoing interactions that we've had that have forced me to think more about psychology, which has actually been really helpful, because originally when I conceptualized this project, I'm like, all right, I live in a med school, I'm going to limit it to biomedicine. That'll be a good way to bound it in order to make a book. And what has become clear to me is that it's not actually helpful to bound it that way, because what I have presented today is a very American story about specific American institutions, but it's also a disciplinary story that really relates much more to biomedicine and preclinical research than it does other areas of research. And so at the moment, this is I'm trying to kind of unpick some of these threads to be able to look at some broader histories that connect these things, as well as to look at it a little bit more internationally, to think about what's going on in the UK, in Germany, and in the Netherlands, to try and give a story that's not quite so centered on American institutions. So one of the things I mentioned in that paper that we published in the special issue with you is that I think that the history of open science reform is a good place to look for thinking about how it is that reformers find each other and connect up with each other. So at present, I've been kind of digging a lot into the history of open science reform and seeing how those actors and institutions play into these transnational networks that have kind of sprung up as a result of reproducibility conversations. And okay, I think I'll leave it there so that we have time for questions, but the labor thing, yes, this is really interesting to think about. In fact, I just recently had a conversation with a friend of mine whose daughter had just finished her PhD at Harvard and started to work for, I can't remember which pharmaceutical company, but went into pharmaceutical research. And she said that the reason that she chose that path was that the working conditions, both in terms of the equipment and resources available to her, as well as the hours and lifestyle, were so much better than even at Harvard. And she thought that if Harvard couldn't provide her with the conditions under which to do the research, then no academic institution would. And so she left for pharma. So it's another interesting instance of this reversal of pharma all of a sudden being the good actor, both in terms of its epistemic practices, but also, as you point out, in terms of the working conditions. So just to say that that syncs with, some of my other anecdotal experience.